Welcome to Modular Games. My name's Kyle. On this channel, we generally talk about various different games, especially role-playing games, and we ask, do the core mechanics of these games actually accomplish their intended purposes? Do they provide the type of gameplay that they try to present to us? In this series, we've been talking a lot about D&D and the core classes of D&D. Today, we're going to talk about the Warlock. Starting things off, addressing the lore of Warlocks, I really wish that I had more to say about them, but the truth is that the lore of Warlocks overlaps so much with other groups that it's really hard to pin down and define who and what they are. Warlocks are defined as people or entities that have contracts or dealings with otherworldly entities in exchange for power. I believe that the core idea of the Warlock comes from a certain story where there's a demon named Mephistopheles, and he makes a bargain with a mortal that gives all sorts of power and fame and wealth and knowledge to that mortal in exchange for this mortal's soul. And the mortal discovers very quickly that despite having all of the things that he could possibly have ever asked for, he's just not happy. There's another book that I've read, I wish I remembered the name of it, that it actually details the journeyings and the story of the very young Mordred, the illegitimate son of King Arthur. And in this story, the Mordred is cast as the hero, and how he's disrespected and he's never recognized by his father, and the story ends in a very tragic way when he gives away his soul in exchange for relief from this pain and suffering. And I think that it's very interesting that the story ends when he gives away his soul. He doesn't talk about the fact that he goes and he works with the Morgan Le Fay, and he doesn't talk about the fact that he ends up killing his father later on. None of those things matter for Mordred because he doesn't have a soul anymore. Your soul is like yourself. So if you give away yourself in exchange for some benefit, then what exactly is left of you to receive the benefits that you bargained for? It's really a very bad deal, and that is part and parcel for the identity of a warlock. Other things to talk about with the warlock is that it's very interconnected with Christian theology, that warlocks or sorcerers or druids would really be defined as the same thing because they're all mortals that have had dealings with various types of spirits in exchange for favors from those spirits. And the fact that they are defined the same way as these other terms causes some significant problems for us when we come into the gaming space, because the gaming space treats them all as very different. Let's see here. There is another thing. In more modern media, warlocks are depicted as entities that do in fact make bargains with otherworldly entities, but they don't necessarily give away their soul. Maybe they trade favors, maybe they give someone else's soul, maybe they have a romantic relationship with this entity that they are gaining power from. I think that the most favorable depiction that I've ever seen of a warlock comes from the Mage Errant series. And in that series, the warlocks are depicted as just another type of spellcaster, but they don't have access to any specific form of magic, and so they're required to make contracts with powerful entities in order to determine what type of magic they will be able to learn. But they generally serve out their contracts with a term of service during their lifetime. The afterlife or the soul is never mentioned at all, and it's simply the fact that these are the only type of people that are capable of taking on the power of those stronger entities. And that puts them in a very, very positive light, especially since the main character of the story is a member of that group. So, where does this leave us with regards to determining the class features that should be given to a warlock? We're kind of in a sticky situation because we don't have a lot of direction for that, but we can look at how warlocks were presented and how they are presented in the game that we're specifically looking at. What do they look like in D&D? And when Warlocks were first presented in D&D, it was back in 3rd edition, I think it was 3.5 actually, and they had two things that were really their hallmark features. First was that they had magical abilities that were usable at will, which is not a unique thing in 5th edition, and that they had magical abilities that are always active, which is still pretty rare, but certainly doable with other classes in 5th edition. So how can we really embody this? How do we really embody this for the Warlock and make them the poster child for at-will and always active effects? I think that the best way to do that is just to go about it very directly. Before we dive too deep into how to handle the Warlock specifically, I think there's a little bit of housekeeping or a looming question really to address, and that is, a lot of players in 5th edition, they don't like the setup that Warlocks have with having their spells come back on a short rest. They like the idea of going out, going on an adventure. They like the cinematic and heroic journey of going and just besting all of your enemies. And the idea that they're going to have to take a break in the middle of that to get their power back, it really throws them off, and they don't like this type of feel. And the other classes, the sorcerers, the clerics, the whatever they are, seem to accomplish this much better. Even the martial classes, they don't really need to take a break the same way that a warlock does. Which is really interesting because it's very different from the intended playstyle for D&D, where you have a battle of attrition, and the warlocks are intended to be that special type of character that doesn't have to worry about the battle of attrition. But in practice, it ends up being the opposite, where the warlock runs out of steam very quickly. They just cast 1 or 2 spells, and they need to recover that somehow. And so either there's a problem with the play style that we're doing, which is kind of silly because obviously people enjoy playing the game this way, or the class is not constructed in a way that supports the intended play style. So before jumping in too much for the warlock, let me just say that with the divine spellcasting classes converting over to the short rest schedule, we don't really need to do that. The presented divine spellcasting classes work just fine even if they are presented as full spellcasters. The miracles mechanic works perfectly well even if you're a full spellcaster. The only difference is that instead of granting you more spells, the miracles mechanic would convert your existing spell slots to providing those miracles. So in the case of the cleric, they would use their divine intervention ability. They would entreat their deity for a certain favor, and if the deity says yes, the cleric gets to say, all right, I asked for this particular spell under these particular circumstances, so I'm going to go ahead and expend that spell slot right now, and it is now a contingent spell effect that once those conditions are met, it's going to happen. Well, what if the deity says no? Well, in that case, no spell slot is expended. No spell slot is expended, and you're not allowed to make the same request until you go through your resting schedule, just like it talks about in the cleric video. I'll go ahead and link that. Likewise, for the druid, you can have the same druid miracles, Nature's Bounty, so that you store your magic in some type of living vessel, and it gets released when someone meets the appropriate requirements. I would say, however, that if clerics and druids and warlocks become full casters, then just having 3 miracles in a day, or having 1, 2, or 3 miracles in a day might not feel like enough, because you get a lot more spells than that. Maybe you should have an option for more of your spells to be presented to you as miracles. And in that case, I would recommend saying that you don't have a limitation of the number of miracles per day. You would instead have a limitation on the number of miracles you have active right now. Because that's really the nature of miracles, is that they get set up and they stick around until they're expended. So in the case of a cleric, they would only have access to a certain number of contingent miracles at a given time. So they request that, hey, when such and such happens, heal Bob so that he doesn't die. And then after that contingent effect is fulfilled, the cleric can go to their deity and make another request so that they only have one pending miracle at a time, only one contingent effect at a time, but so long as they have spell slots to expend, they can get more miracles. And as they advance in level, they can have more of these miracles active at a time, more of these contingent effects pending at a time. Similarly, the druid would be able to have a certain number of stored spells at a given time, and they wouldn't be able to recover those spell slots while the spells are still stored. But once that spell gets expended, the druid can go over and store another spell. They have a maximum of 1, 2, or 3 spells stored in their grove at any given time. Or if they haven't designated a specific grove, any living plant. Similarly, the Warlock's miracle ability would work the same way. So what is that miracle ability? The Warlock's miracle ability is actually arguably much more powerful than the cleric or the druid, because the Warlock has a power called has a class feature called Incarnation of Power. Well, as an Incarnation of Power, you get to choose on level up an incarnation spell. And this incarnation spell is going to be always active, all the time. You have to choose a spell that is targeting yourself, which means that it has to have a range of self or a range of touch. And if it has a range of touch, then it's considered to be one spell level higher than it actually is, which means that you don't get access to all of those spells quite as fast as you would normally expect to have them. But it's a balancing measure because touch spells have a lot of variety and can do a lot of things. And in addition to that, if you have to designate a target other than the general range, such as for the scrying spell, you designate that when you designate you designate that target at the same time that you choose this spell as your incarnation spell, which means that when you gain a level, you can choose scrying, but every time you scry, you're going to be targeting that same person, you're going to be looking at that same person. I wouldn't recommend you actually use that option. My personal favorite is Vampiric Touch, because Vampiric Touch is a personal range spell, but it allows you to, every time you touch someone, you deal damage. You gain a permanent touch effect that deals damage. Just be careful about shaking hands with people, because you will kill the mayor by accident if you forget that you have Vampiric Touch active all the time. Towards that end, things like invisibility also wouldn't work, because as soon as you deal damage to something, you're no longer invisible, and you have to refresh that somehow, but your only means of refreshing it is if you gain a character level, which is bad. Mirror Image works the same way. Crown of Stars works the same way. They're available options, but they're very bad options. Okay, so you've got that. Obviously, having something like this is very powerful. So what are the counterbalance procedures going on here that make it okay? Well, like I said, if you have Vampiric Touch active, this is going to be extremely inconvenient. And it turns out that most of the available spells have issues like that. They're things that you really don't want to have active all the time, because you could injure someone that's supposed to be your ally. Also, there's a balancing measure in that you only select this spell when you gain a character level. You cannot change what incarnation of power you have on a daily basis. I think another really good option for this is a touch range spell called Flock of Familiars. Well, Flock of Familiars actually has the same problem as Mirror Image and Crown of Stars and Invisibility, and that is, if someone kills one of your familiars, you ain't getting it back until you gain a character level. But so long as those familiars are still alive, it's a fantastic benefit having like 7 of them, which will be at later levels, of course. And that's really where we get the balancing the balancing point for this. I should make a little aside here that if you want to make the Warlock into a normal full caster, then your incarnation spell is going to take up not one spell slot, which is permanently in use, but two spell slots of the same level that are permanently in use, which means you won't be able to select an incarnation spell until you have two spell slots of that level, which is going to be extremely inconvenient if you want to select something like Glibness, an 8th level spell. If you have the short rest recovery schedule, then you're gaining an incarnation spell. But if you are full caster, you are converting your spell slots into this incarnation permanent ability. Maybe you don't want to give up both of your 3rd level slots. Maybe you don't want to give up both of your 5th level slots. And so you choose something smaller. Well, that's a trade-off, and it's a choice in your character build. And it ends up looking a lot like options that the Warlock already has, such as Mask of Many Faces, or Fiendish Vigor, or other options. Okay, what else do we have? Clearly this is not the only change for the Warlock. It turns out that having an incarnation spell is, it's obviously very powerful. And since you're going to be gaining this level, and since you're going to be gaining this feature at level 2, just like you do with all of your other miracles, what does that mean for your other features? Can you still justify having the same features? Do you still get a Pact Boon, because that's a powerful feature? Do you still get the same number of Eldritch Invocations, because those are powerful features? And the answer is, we're going to move around all of that stuff. First up, Eldritch Blast is out. You don't get Eldritch Blast, it's not a cantrip anymore. Second, Hex is out. Hex is not a spell anymore, it doesn't exist anymore, it is gone. Which means that at level 1, you don't have your primary 2 options that you were expecting to use for your whole career. Okay, that opens up a big power gap that we can put our incarnation spells into, but we don't get that until level 2. What do we do at level 1? Well, it turns out that getting incarnation spells at level 2 and then coming over at level 3 and getting your Pact Boon, that's going to be really too much, especially given that your subclass is also going to grant features at level 3 now. So we take our Pact Boon and we move that to level 1, and we make it weaker. I'll go ahead and list these on the screen here. If you want a familiar, you just get a normal familiar. If you want to upgrade it to that better familiar, you can go and take an Eldritch Invocation to do that. If you want to have Pact of the Blade, then guess what? You have to bond an actual item. You aren't given an item, which means that you're not able to change this item into whatever physical object you want. You have to actually bond that item. It's more like the Eldritch Knight's weapon bond ability, where they can just summon it to their hand whenever they want. Oh, and if you want to add your charisma modifier for attack and damage rather than your strength or dexterity, there's an Eldritch Invocation for that as well, because let's be serious, the Hexblade gets too much fame and fortune for this already. Okay, what's next? We have a reduced power Pact Boon at level 1. I also got rid of the Pact of the Tome and replaced it with 2 other options. We have the Pact of Hexes, in case you liked having Hex, and we have the Pact of Eldritch Power, in case you liked having an Eldritch Blast. Everybody else is probably just going to use a crossbow or something. It's not that big of a power dip. Alright, what next? What do you get at level 3? Well, you get your subclass features. Okay, well, it's level 3. Is it appropriate to... it didn't used to be level 3. We're just going to give the level 1 features for Warlock at level 3 because they were some really good features, and delaying them to level 3 seems reasonably fair. Except for the Hexblade, which I would probably just wipe out of the entire game if I had my way, and I would do something much more Spectre-related rather than weapon-related. But that's an issue for another time. What do we get after this? Well, we get our subclass features at level 6, move to level 7 because of the 1D&D changes, and at later levels we're going to have those incarnation spells that are getting much more and more powerful, and that's really it, except that some of our Eldritch Invocations need some adjustment. Assuming that you are assuming that you are sticking with the short rest schedule, we're going to take all of those Eldritch invocations that say you can cast this spell once per day by expending a Warlock spell slot. Those features are now different. You now have the option to cast those spells as miracles, which means that you give up one of your incarnation spells in order to have an available slot to use these specialized invocation spells, which gives you a degree of flexibility that a pure incarnation Warlock wouldn't have. Likewise, the Mystic Arcanum feature is presented as an available Eldritch Invocation at level 11, which means that if you want to actually cast a Warlock spell of 6th level or higher, you take that Eldritch Invocation and you now have effectively a spell slot. It's just like Mystic Arcanum, but you're giving up one of your incarnation spells in order to do this. It's a degree of flexibility in exchange for raw power, and that's kind of the exchange that a lot of classes have. It's just a bit more explicit with the Warlock, and I think that a lot of players would really prefer to have the flexibility rather than the power in this case, because I mean, just take a look at these spells that are available as incarnation spells. It's a much shorter list than the actual Warlock list. And if you add in the items for patrons, I mean, there are a few really nice standout options, like Greater Invisibility, and Hollow. Hollow is an amazing option, especially given that it'll automatically follow you around everywhere you go. But yeah, you don't have a lot of options for incarnation spells, so the Mystic Arcanum Eldritch Invocation is almost a must-have. I would actually recommend saying that you should reduce the number of invocations that you receive on the class table by 1 and just give them the Mystic Arcanum Invocation. But for flexibility's sake, we're not going to do that quite yet. Here's the table, just in case I didn't display it earlier. And so let's talk about what this actually turns the Warlock into. I think this turns the Warlock into a very, very visceral and quite terrifying incarnation of the power of their patron. If you work for that demon lord over there, then you are going to be embodying the most powerful spells that a demon can bring to bear. If you are the messenger of a saint or of an angel, then you're going to have some. Okay, it doesn't actually work very well for the celestial patron, but you're going to bring to bear a type of power that clerics simply can't match. Sure, you don't have those contingent spell effects, but the fact that you have 1 or 2 spell effects that never goes away and can't truly be dispelled either. Warlocks are terrifying, absolutely terrifying, because you simply can't take away the tools that they normally have. And that gives them a class distinction that I don't think anybody can really match other than the pure martials. The pure martials really never can lose their power in a meaningful way unless they're bound, gagged, and unconscious. The Warlock is kind of the same thing. They cannot have that power taken away. Even if they have everything dispelled, they just get it right back. Even if they're in an anti-magic field, they get it right back. And in some circumstances, they might even be able to ignore the anti-magic field? Okay, probably not, but that would be an interesting mechanic as well. I certainly know that other classes in the past have had that. Give me your ideas and your thoughts of what you think of this version of the Warlock, because this version of the Warlock is, I think you would agree, if you're fighting against them, it's quite terrifying. But if you're playing as them, it feels kind of, I mean, it's strong, obviously, but it's also kind of gimpy, because you don't have the daily options that you normally would have. You're locking yourself in for these specific spell options that might only be useful in certain circumstances. If you're in combat every day, then permanent vampiric touch is great, until you're talking to the king and the guards ask you to leave your weapons at the door. Warlock can't do that. I guess he waits at the door while the rest of the party goes and talks to the king. that kind of fits for who warlocks are. I don't think you would trust someone like that with the king anyways. So having a mechanical reason for that level of distrust is kind of nice. Meanwhile, if you have that flock of familiars, you can just, sit on a park bench and be Odin. Yeah, you have like 16 ravens bringing you information from across the land. Or you get the idea. And it's a very visceral feeling of power that no other class currently matches. But I at least hope that it's balanced. If it's not, punch holes in my ideas. Please punch holes in these ideas, because I could just release another video that explains how things are different. Go ahead and, like, subscribe, leave those comments I already told you about, and I'll see you next time.